Good morning and welcome everyone to our webinar today. Today our presenter is Nate Boettcher. He's the application engineer for Fastpath, and he's been focusing on Dynamics NAV for the past 3 years. Today he's going to present to us native controls in Microsoft Dynamics NAV. And I just want to remind everybody that even though you are muted as an attendee, I do have a question box that you can type in your questions at any time, and we can get those answered by Nate. So Nate, with that, I'm going to hand it over to you.
Sounds good. Thank you, Abby. So as she said, today's presentation is going to be about native controls in Microsoft Dynamics NAV. And just to flesh that a little bit more, native controls that exist around security, audit, and compliance inside the NAV product. As she said, my name is Nate Boettcher. I'm an applications engineer at Fastpath. Just to give you a quick overview of just who we are as a company and kind of the background that I'm coming from to give this presentation today. Fastpath is an ISV that focuses on the security, audit, and compliance function. We go across all the Dynamics products. I am the technical lead for the NAV side of our stuff, or side of our business here. So I'm starting to get out to the NAVUG and do some more presentations and getting involved in the community a little bit more. So I look forward to being more involved and hopefully seeing some of you attendees at NAVUG Summit here coming up in October. That's just a little bit about what we do. I'll jump to the next screen here and just kind of give you an agenda of what today is going to look like, what I'm going to try to cover today. And that way you can get a better idea, start thinking maybe you have some questions about certain areas. First thing we're going to do just a general introduction here, and then I'm going to focus on 6 areas that we can look at the native controls inside of NAV. So we'll look at the security model, security reporting, administrative access, segregation of duties, audit trails, and workflow. And basically these 6 areas are going to be some items that you can focus on to help you be compliant inside of your NAV system, your environment. And whether you have an internal audit team, you have external auditors, whatever your audit requirements are, I think these 6 areas are good ones to focus on to help you start getting on the right track. And maybe you are on some areas, and some other areas you can bring it up to par a little bit. So I'll go through for each area. What native controls do exist inside of NAV. If they do exist, kind of give you an examples of how to use them, how to set up, how to set those up. And then there's also going to be a couple of these areas there actually aren't any native controls inside Dynamics NAV. And so when we hit those areas, I'm going to try to give you some tips and tricks on things you can do to still be compliant in those areas without the help of the tools inside of NAV. So that's what we're going to kind of try to focus on. Again, if you have any questions, feel free to type them into your question box, and then Abby will just interrupt the presentation. We can take questions throughout, and then also do some more at the end. So like I said, I'm an applications engineer, 5+ years of experience in software development. Here at Fastpath, I primarily am a developer developing new features, bugs and fixes, and all that kind of stuff. Focusing primarily, like I said, on the NAV side of things. All of our products go across the Dynamics space, but I'm focused on the NAV side. And then 3 years of Microsoft Dynamics experience while I've been at Fastpath. So this next slide, usually when I give this presentation, it's more in a setting where I'm actually in a room with the panelists, so I can get an idea, or the attendees, so I can get an idea of what we're working with. But the NAV version, I would say primarily the clients that I've seen and worked with here at Fastpath, majority are still on 2009, NAV 2009. Some of my presentation I've geared towards, and the screenshots you'll see are geared towards coming out of NAV 2013. So there'll be some slight differences there, especially if you're on the classic client from 2009. You will see a significant difference there with the roll-to-the client in 2013. But a lot of the stuff does go across the 2 versions, and if there is differences, I'll point a couple of those out as we go along. And then I usually like to get a feel of who's kind of in the room. Finance and audit, people like to usually focus more on the audit side of things, where the IT guys, they're more focused on, the security model and how am I locking down my security and NAV and all that kind of stuff. So there could be a range of folks here. I'll try to hit on all the areas. But again, if you're a finance or an audit person, I'm getting too technical, feel free to just ask a question or let Abby know that you'd like some more information, not so technical. So we'll try to gear it towards if anybody out there has got specific requests. So the first thing I'm going to talk about, the first area where there's for sure native control inside of NAV. People may not think of it as a control, but the first area we're going to talk about is actually the security model. So obviously you can secure access inside of NAV. You can also not secure access. You could actually assign super access to all your users, and therefore basically there is no security within inside of your system, because you're giving everyone rights to do whatever they want inside of your system, but it's certainly not advised. So I'm going to kind of go through the security model, what that looks like, how you can use it, how you can set it up to actually secure your NAV environment and secure your NAV data behind the scenes. So at a high level, you're going to have a user object that's assigned a permission set or multiple permission sets. You can also think of permission sets as a role. And some of the other Dynamics products, they just call them roles. So I may refer to them probably as roles going forward, but the actual window inside of NAV actually says permission set. And then once those permission sets are made up a list of securable objects or permissions, and so there's a couple different object types within inside of NAV. The next slide I actually have an image that we'll get to that'll kind of lay out a little bit better. But there's table data, table object, or report object, code unit object, pages, and forms. So there's a host of different objects that you can actually assign security to. So within a permission set, within a single role, you can assign multiple permissions to different objects within inside of your system. So the first one, the one that's kind of sticks out and where most companies and most clients focus their attention to is the table data object. And that's because that's actually giving access to make data changes to that table data inside of your NAV database. So whether it's the customer table, the sales order, sales line tables, you're actually giving access to that table. And so there's access types, what I'll refer to as access types. So you can have read, insert, modify, and delete access type on the table data object. And within that, each of those permissions, you can have an access level. Access levels are either yes, no, or indirect. So I can say, yes, I have read access, yes, I have insert, yes, I have modify, yes, I have delete. So you can have those different levels of permission on that access type for an object. You can also have, so it's either yes or no, and then the last one is actually indirect permission. This one gets a little complex to trying to wrap your head around, and certainly to demo in a short amount of time. I'll have a couple slides here after this slide that will delve into the indirect permission a little bit. But at a high level, an indirect permission, you can give an indirect permission to any of those access types on table data. So I could have indirect permission to insert into table data, indirect permission to insert and to modify, indirect permission to delete certain table data. At a high level, that indirect permission is basically only giving you half of the yes permission. So if that's the only permission you have, the indirect permission, and you don't get the other half of the permission from somewhere in the application, you're actually going to get an error saying you don't have permission to insert or modify or delete on this table data. Where the other half of the permission comes into play is all the other objects that I talked about, so pages, code units, those type of things. You can actually assign table data permissions to that object, and that's where the other half of the object indirect permission comes from. So if I have a code unit that gets, so when I post the sales order, when I post that sales order, there's a code unit that gets executed. When we execute that code unit, there's going to be some permissions that are assigned to that code unit. And so we take the permissions on that code unit and match it up with, if you have an indirect permission on a table, if there's two that match there, so let's say the sales line table, if I have modify indirect permission on sales line and code unit has access to modify sales line, those two permissions come together to create the full yes permission. So that's kind of what the indirect permission is for. How it's used most of the time, and you'll see it's focusing around the posting routines. So you're not actually giving a user full access to go and access all the table data objects that they need to actually do posting of any sorts inside of NAV. And you actually, that's where the code units come into play, and the permissions are listed on that code unit, and you just give indirect permission. So you have to at least match the two and actually go through the formal process of that posting, calling that code unit to get the full permission. That just a nice way to secure those tables, so you don't have full yes permission. You can't get someone to actually go in there and start making changes. If you give them indirect and they start to go make changes directly in those tables, they'll get an error. So that just secures those posting routines and make sure those are being done correctly through the application. So beyond table data, like I said, there's some other objects. All the other objects except table data, there's only one access type, and that's execute. And then on execute, you only have two access levels, yes or no. So on a particular page, let's take the customer page, for example. You have an execute access type on that page, and you either have a yes or no, I can't execute it. If I have a yes, I can execute this page, it'll allow you to open the customer page. So that's the difference between the objects, access types, and access levels. So a little bit more outside of coming out of the box with NAV, there's a basic permission set that I wanted to just kind of bring to attention. This basic permission set, in 2013 they call it basic, in 2009 they call it the all role. But basically what this basic permission set does, it gives best practice recommendation is to assign this to all your users. Because at a high level what the basic permission set does, it gives the user enough privileges to actually open the application, navigate around the application, any system type of permissions that user would need to actually open NAV and use NAV, those permissions are in the basic permission set. So one example that I like to point out here, if you have the change log on in NAV, that permission to write the entries to the changelog table is in the basic permission set. So if you have changelog on, someone goes and changes some data, and they write a changelog entry, they're going to get the permission to write to that table from this basic permission set. So that's what the use there for the basic permission set is, or if you're in 2009, it would be called the all role. And then also on these permission sets, if you have multiple companies, you can actually assign permission sets per company or to all companies. So if you only have one, if users should only be working inside of one company, you can limit them to that one company by just assigning that permission set to that company. So as I said, kind of the starting top point was a user. There's a couple different types of users that you can have. They're all, I kind of group them under the user record, but there's different types of them. The first one is Windows authentication. So this is you create a user and you actually link that user to their Active Directory Windows logon. So when a person logs onto their computer, they authenticate to Windows through Active Directory. They go to launch NAV. They're already authenticated, so they're not going to be prompted through user ID and password. And then they get into the application, and then you assign security to that user based on that Windows authentication. The next item is NAV authentication, so you actually have a NAV user ID and password. This has nothing to do with Active Directory or linking to a Windows ID. I also refer to these users as just database users. And then the last one will be Windows groups. So you can go in there, create a new user in NAV, and link it to an existing Active Directory Windows security group. And then you can assign permission sets to that Windows group. And then what that does, it actually allows you to add users to that Windows group, and then those users would inherit the access that was assigned to that Windows group. So if you're a larger company and you have, let's say, 10 AP clerks that should have all the same permissions, then you can create a Windows group for those AP clerks, assign the permission sets to the group, and then you'll have to do that assigning that permission once. And then as long as they're a member of that group, they will just inherit the permissions. It's nice if you also expand and you're hiring new employees. you can just throw them into a Windows group, and you don't have to worry about going out and figuring out what roles do I need to assign to this user. We just put them in this group, and it's taken care of. So we'll go to the next slide here. This is the image I was talking about, just to kind of give you a little bit better graphical layout of what I was talking about there. Start at the top with the user or the Windows group, assigned down to a permission set. And then you can see here in the box on the bottom, those are actually the securable objects that I was talking about. So you have table data, securable object, and then the rest that you see there, I put the access types below the actual objects. So table, report, code unit, XML port, menu, suite, page, query, and system. Those are the other securable objects that you either have execute yes or execute no permission to. Table data is the only one that has the read, insert, modify, and delete, because that's actually where your data changes are taking place on that object. Along with that, the table data is most commonly where I see customers, and I work with customers where they're actually doing their security. I've talked to a handful of customers in the past, whether it's at NAVBug or Convergence or somewhere where I'm meeting with a customer, but they're actually trying to assign security like at a page level. And what that means, they actually give full access to all the table data, and then they try to lock down what pages can that person open. It gets extremely difficult just because of the amount of pages that there are. The other caution I have when I talk to customers that are doing that is if you're giving full access to table data, and somehow that user gets access to the NAV development environment or the object designer, they can actually go ahead and open that table data and start making table data changes because they have full access to every table. So there's a little bit of a caution there. So usually we do recommend securing at the table data level. Out of the box, and that is what you'll see. But like you said, there is multiple ways you can do security, so that is one way, but we recommend securing at the table data level. Other things I'll mention with the security model while we're here. Implementation and upgrades are great times to actually look at your security model. There may be some of you out there that you just have everybody assigned to super just because you haven't had time to look at your security and you just need your people to be able to do their jobs. So whenever you're going, let's say you're thinking about upgrading in 2009 to 2013, that's a great time to actually have a project set aside in your company that actually is addressing your security model, who's assigned to what inside of your NAV system. One of the things, I do a couple different presentations around security, but another presentation I have is actually how to go throughout that process of determining what your security is going to be. So at a high level, if you are thinking about actually addressing the security model in an upcoming upgrade or implementation of NAV, or you figure out I need to take care of this, one of the things that we had advised, and it will help you trying to set up the security model for the first time because it can be extremely daunting with the amount of objects that are in NAV, is to kind of set out and make a matrix. And we like to put on the left side of the matrix any role inside of your company. So if it's an AR clerk, an AP clerk, a warehouse employee, any of those different roles that have access to should have access to NAV. And then across the top will be actually functions that you can do with NAV, and then you can go and mark off this person should be able to do this function, this function, this function, and that kind of gives you a starting point of where do I even need to start create. So then you kind of think about those ones atop the cross are kind of like your permission sets or your roles. So then you can kind of get a good idea, a starting point of what that should look like. But then the difficult part about that is, so I got this great matrix and it tells me who should have access to what, but then actually deploying that and creating a permission set and adding the different objects and the table data and the different access types and levels can be a little daunting. So one of the tools that I recommend taking a look at, and it's actually part of, with your NAV license, you get a copy of NAV Easy Security Lite. You can actually go in, let's say you're in your development, your test environment, you can turn on their security tracking feature, and that way what happens is you turn on a security profile, you have your users go in there and complete all the functions that they would do in their daily job, and behind the scenes it's recording what access types and levels it needs to what objects, and then when they're all done, you push stop on their little security tracking, and then you can actually import that trace that just happened, and it'll actually generate a role for you with all the correct objects, all the correct access types, and all the correct access levels. So it's a really handy tool to use if you're thinking about actually going and implementing a security model. The last thing on security model, it's one of those things that you can't just do once and forget it, just set it and forget it, because there's always probably going to be new objects. One of the nice things about NAV is you can customize it, which means you're going to have new objects, whether it's code units or pages or new tables. You're going to need to make sure you secure those new objects if you do some customizations. New employees, if you're expanding your company and you get a new role, you're going to need to figure out what that permission set looks like for that role. And then anytime you get a new process, if you're implementing a warehouse or whatever it may be, you always got to take into account any of those new items, new objects, employees, or processes, and try to develop a security model around those. So here's just a screenshot from 2013. I just pulled up the out-of-the-box rule called cost, and here you can see the permissions assigned to that cost role. On the left side, you see table data, the object ID and name, and then you can see the different access types. So read, insert, modify, and delete. And then within each of those access types, you can see there's assigned access levels. So you can see yes and indirect there. You see the blank spaces, that means no, you don't have access to that. So that's kind of what it looks like to actually go and assign permissions to a permission set. As I said, that basic role that comes with NAV 2013, here's just a little bit there's a bunch more security here than you can see in this one screenshot, as you can tell by the scroll bar. But just a little bit of a screenshot, and one of the other things I'm going to point out, so you can see the top couple 8 rows or whatever is the table data objects that it's getting assigned access to. And then you see there's some entries for table, report, code unit, XML port, menu suite, page, and query that have a 0 next to them. Anytime you see that table, an object, and then a 0, that actually means every single table within the system. So for all tables in the system, you can see if you trace it over, it actually says yes, execute permission, that 5th column on access type there. So it's basically saying I have, if you jump down, let's say code unit, I have access to execute every single code unit inside the system. And the reason for that is out of the box, NAV is securing data at the table data level. They're not securing at the code unit or the page level. They're not restricting what pages a user can see. They're restricting what data you can access. So whether you can read the data, insert, modify, or delete the data. So that's why you see that there. So to get into that indirect permission just a little bit more, the example I like to use here is posting a sales order. When you post a sales order, one of the items it does, it includes a delete of a sales line record or a multiple sales line record. So you're going to need, when you post a sales order, your user is going to need access to delete a sales line record. So here's I just took a screenshot. This is one of our tools, but it gives us a good layout of what permission my user has. So I was using this user called Kmore, and the line highlighted on the left side there, you can see is my table data sales line object. And for that, I have yes, I can read data for that table. I have indirect insert, yes, modify, indirect delete. So those two there, I'm going to point out, insert and delete, are indirect permissions. So by what I was saying earlier, kind of when we talked about indirect permission at a high level, that's only half of the permission that you need. So when I'm going to go post a sales order and delete a record from the sales line table, I only have indirect permission. So I'm going to need to get the other half of the permission from some object, whether it's a code unit or a page that has the other half of the permission. So out of the box, I took this from the NAV development environment where you can actually change those permissions, but out of the box, here's the code unit sales order permissions that it's assigned. So you can see that first entry there is the sales line table. I have insert, modify, and delete access to that sales line table. So pairing this access with the indirect delete access assigned to that user, I have the two halves of the permission that I need to create the full yes permission, and when I go to post a go to post a sales order, it posted successfully because I had those two permissions working together. Now if we go on the flip side, just to demonstrate what the indirect access is and how it works, I went in and modified that code unit sales order that gets executed when I click the post button, and I removed the access to that sales line table. So you see in that first line I have sales line, and I took off the check marks for insert, modify, and delete. Once I did that, I saved it, compiled it, restarted the service tier, and then went back into NAV with my user and tried to post a sales order again. And you'll see here on the bottom right I got an error message saying you do not have the following permissions on table data sales line, and it's looking for the delete permission. That's because on my user level I just have indirect permission to that table. I removed the other half of the access that I was getting through the code unit. With those two combined, I'm still only left with half my access, and it throws an error. So that's kind of a little bit demonstration on how the indirect permission works. So that all is kind of what we just talked about there is the security model. So the security model is kind of the root of everything. For security reporting, you actually have to have security assigned to do some reporting. One of the other areas we'll talk about is segregation of duties. To analyze your segregation of duties analysis, you're actually going to have security assigned. So it's kind of the building block of where we start with being compliant in any Dynamics environment and here at NAV. So once you get that model set up and you actually get your security assigned, now you can go into these other areas. So the first area we're going to talk about is security reporting. And security reporting is one of the difficult spots because NAV out of the box, there is no native control to help you with this. There isn't any security reports. You can go in NAV, click a report, and it'll just spit out a report showing your security that you've assigned. There isn't anything in the box that does that. So you're going to need to do, whether you have processes in your company that you do this manually, you do it yourself, or you have a third party to help you with it. Just some general tips and tricks on how to do security reporting, what auditors are going to look for in your security reports. So if there's nothing standard, you're most likely going to have to do something manual. And so just some general reports that an auditor is going to look for is what roles are assigned to a user, and then even taking that farther, what permissions are assigned to that role, so you can kind of compare those two together and actually get a picture of what access is assigned to that user. So they come into your company and do an audit, or your internal audit team is, I want to know whoever has access to edit customer master data. So you would need a manual report or some report to actually go out and look at that customer object and see who has insert, modify, and delete access to that customer object. The other kind of funny thing there is, how do you report on indirect access? Just for a standpoint of Fastpath and how we address that issue, we consider indirect access, basically we treat it as full yes access, just because we don't necessarily know what objects permissions are assigned to the code units and pages, and those can be changed. So it's hard to actually report on that because it's all in the development environment. It's not easily accessible running a SQL query. So that's difficult. So we count, from Fastpath, we count indirect access as a yes permission when you do security reporting. So those are just some examples of some reports, what an auditor would look like. So to achieve this, whether you have a SQL team in-house or DBAs in-house that can write SQL database queries, there's probably 5 or 6 security tables where you'd actually be able to access all this information. There's some, obviously some more advanced queries that you can write, and then you can, if you have SSRS, SQL reporting services, you can actually hook into those SQL databases and run those reports and actually get something, that actually looks like a report from SQL reporting services. So those are kind of some reports, how you could build them, the tools that you can use. But the other half of that is actually, once you do have those reports, what are you doing with those reports? So you're going to actually have to have some process around what are your reports showing you, who's reviewing those reports, how often are they reviewing those reports, Are they giving any evidence that they did review them and they're signing off and saying, hey, this is okay, or we need to look at X, Y, and Z from this report? So auditors are going to come in and say, okay, so you have some of these reports, what are you doing with them? So you can actually have some evidence saying, we have a schedule that we produce this report every month, and Joe, my manager from accounting, reviews this report every month to validate that his employees have the correct access, what they should have access to. So you got to build some process around reviewing those reports, who's reviewing them, and actually having some evidence that you do review them and have some evidence of a sign-off. The biggest question is who actually reviews them. One of the big things that we advocate here at Fastpath is you actually put this back into managers or business process owners' hands to actually review these access reports. For one reason is if you have your IT manager or your IT folks reviewing these reports, well, they've been told to give access to these certain people, so they're going to think what they've assigned is correct. But you're going to have to actually get it back to the manager and the business process owner to say, these employees of yours have this access to do these items in NAV, is that correct? And there's going to have to be some teamwork there, because if you give an access report that basically lists out security objects inside of NAV, the managers of business process owners may not exactly know how to translate those items. So there's going to have to be some teamwork between the IT department and the business process owners and the managers that are reviewing those reports to kind of get a common ground of what that actually means, and then the business process owners can actually review those and have an accurate view of what does it actually mean and what does that look like. So that's kind of security reporting. Unfortunately, like I said, there's no standard functionality. I've had some conversations. We work as a company. We work closely with Merge Tool and their easy security products, and I've talked with Per before, and he has brought up the concern about these reports as well. And I think the last time we talked, he was thinking about adding some of these to the Easy Security Lite product, which would mean you would have a few of these security reports out of the box. That would at least give you your user list, what roles are assigned, and some general information like that. But otherwise than that, it's going to be on your company to develop these. So we'll go to the next item, administrative access. And when we talk about administrative access in NAV, it's related to those super roles. These super roles are created out of the box, so they can be dangerous if they get assigned to somebody. But one common pitfall we see with our customers is they just assign super access because they don't want to deal with security and they just want their employees to be able to do their jobs. There's a huge risk there. Something we really advise against. One of the things I like to do when I'm doing this as an in-person presentation is actually get a count of how many people in the room actually have super access, and it's a little concerning when you have half the room actually raise their hands that they have super access. But out of the box, there's two roles. There's a super permission set and there's a super data permission set. Basically, super gives you full access to every single object inside the system. Super data just gives you full access to all the table data objects. I have screenshots of these that we'll look at next. But that's what those out-of-the-box roles look like. If you're implementing for the first time, the first user that gets created in NAV is actually assigned the super role. So that's a bit of caution. You have to readdress that hopefully after you get your NAV environment up and going. There's actually no formal requirement for a super role. Some of the other Dynamics systems, whether it's promoting code changes or doing certain functions inside of the Dynamics environment, actually do require a sysadmin or a super kind of user. But with NAV, there's actually no formal requirement, which means we really would advise that this not be used at all, just to really hammer down that security access and try to secure your environment as it should be, and actually prove to your auditors that it's locked down. We don't have anybody assigned to use super role. That's one of the first reports they asked for is who's assigned the super role. So if you are using it, there should probably be some good explanation of why you are using it. But that's one of the really easy, if you do have SQL access and some DBA that has some query writing expertise, is just write a security report that looks for any users that are assigned to this super role. It's one of the really easy ones, and one easy security report that you can create and monitor on an ongoing basis to see if that's ever assigned. One thing about the super role, it's not programmatic. So in some of the other Dynamics products it is, but in NAV it's actually assigned permissions. So you will actually go into open up the super role or permission set, and you would actually see permissions assigned to it. Now they'll all be zeros and they'll all be yes, full access, but permissions are actually assigned to that role. One of the recommendations I like, and I actually got this from our friends at Merge Tool, is actually creating a super read role. Let's say you have a vice president or some manager that wants to be able to go in and look at data and look at numbers, but they actually don't need any access to perform any function inside the system. You could create a super read role. It's not out of the box, but you could create it yourself and actually assign yes, full read access on all table data objects. It won't give them any segregation of duties conflicts. There won't be any issue there because they won't have the read, insert, modify, and delete access. They would just have the read, or the insert, modify, or delete access. They would just have read. So it's one easy way. If you have employees saying, "I need to go look at this," you can just create a role and give them full access to look at everything. If if they're to that certain level within your company, but you can still lock down that they can't actually change any data. So that's one good recommendation. So if we look at a couple screenshots here, so here's the super role. As I said, you're going to see every object type listed, so table data through system on the left side. Like I said, the zero, if you see the zero there on object ID, that means every single object within the system. And then you see full yeses across all entries, which means they have access to do absolutely everything they want to inside the system. Super data, this one's assigned just full access to the table data objects. It's just another out-of-the-box role that is there. And then that super read that I was talking about, if you wanted to create this on your own, it's extremely easy. Create a new permission set called super read. You assign it the table data 0, which means all table data objects, and just assign it yes to the read permission, and that's all there will be. And then that will give that employee or that person full access to read any type of data inside the system if that's a requirement. So that's security reporting there, administrative access. The next item is segregation of duties. This is probably going to be the most difficult one for NAV customers, just because segregation of duties at a high level is sort of complex and difficult to get done anyway. And then on top of that, there is no standard functionality or native control inside NAV to help you with this. So at a high level, just some tips and tricks of what you can do to try to achieve segregation of duties. If you're a public company, publicly traded company, you know what segregation of duties is just by the requirements of SOX. But at a high level, you have to have some methodology to follow. So you have to have some idea of what segregation of duties is and have that methodology. There's a bunch out there. But once you have that methodology, you need a rule set to identify conflicts in your system. So the rule set is actually saying if you have access to this and this inside the system, that's going to be a conflict. There's a ISACA SOD rule set. At the end, my email address is going to be on the last slide. We have this in-house that we provide to, every time we do a presentation, we say if you want this ISACA SOD rule set, it's a standard one. It's not NAV specific, but it's going to be standard for an ERP system. You can use that to at least start and trying to identify what those rules need to look like for NAV. So it's a great place to start. And like I said, if you want that SOD rule set from ISACA, just let me know. My contact information will be at the end, and we can get that sent off to you. So once you have that rule set, you're going to need to build some solution to test your security that you've assigned against those rules. So whether it's some custom solution that you guys, your company spends a lot of time on developing, whether it's a manual automated solution. Obviously, one of the things about auditors is they don't like anything new or customly made. So if it's going to be something that you make in-house to apply or to analyze your segregation of duties, the best bet would be to build something automated and get the auditors on board with your automated solution. If it's automated, you know you have a certain process that you go through every time. It takes out the manual human error element. So it's one easy way to do it, or one good way to do it, but it's not going to be easy. The other way is you can do a manual solution. It's going to take more time, and it may not be as good of a test as an automated solution or some third-party solution that you could get. If you do go the manual route, just one example of what that could look like for you and your company is just to do a manual transaction sampling. So you can turn on the change log in NAV, and actually you can take all your vendor changes, your master data vendor changes, and compare them to all the purchase order entries, postings that have been done in your side of your system. So once you do that, you can actually compare who's making these vendor changes and then who's making these purchase order creations, postings, and all those type of things. And then you can compare those two sets of data. Is there any overlap between users? That's going to be one of the first keys that you're going to want to look for if someone has access to create a vendor and then go create a purchase order for that vendor. It's going to be one easy way to look at things. There's obviously going to be a whole host of these transaction samplings that you can do. And that's kind of where it goes back to your rule set with your that you build in the beginning steps. Is, let's say, and a rule example could be vendor master data and purchase orders, and that's one of the things that you can manually compare with just a simple transaction sampling. However, if you do that transaction sampling, you know you're not going to get the full data set, and it's going to probably be nearly impossible to do it manually, to look at all of your transactions all the time. So it's going to be difficult, but at least it's a starting point, and somewhere you can start and see if you have some segregation of duties conflicts within inside your system. One of the things we talk about when we talk about segregation of duties and we're implementing our tools at a customer site is, if you run a segregation of duties analysis, most likely you're not going to have zero conflicts. It's going to be very, very hard to get your conflicts to zero. If you run your report, your analysis, and you do notice some things you can change, that's great based on just security access. But it's going to be extremely hard and probably not even possible to get it down to zero. And some of our clients expect it to be zero, but it's not really, especially if you're a small company, it's not going to be something that's very viable to do. Just because if you only have one AP clerk in your entire company, they're going to have multiple job ads that they do, probably ending up in some kind of security access segregation of duties conflict. So the thing that you can do beyond changing your security is actually having some process controls. One of our mottos around here in segregation of duties is to actually balance your process controls and your system security. So you have a balance of who has access to what in my system, in my NAV system. And then where I still do have conflicts because they need that access, I have some outside secondary process control that can mitigate that. So basically you go through and have process controls, like whether you're tracking, let's say you have a conflict between vendor changes and purchase orders, if someone can do both of those items. You could turn on the change log, and you're tracking data changes for those, and someone's reviewing that data change log for vendor changes and purchase order changes. That would be a mitigating control of turning on tracking and actually reviewing those reports of those changes. So that's just one example. But with segregation of duties, it's totally a balance of process controls and system security. Kind of back to what we said with security reporting. One of the biggest things is just to be able to build a repeatable process, have a review schedule, who should be reviewing these conflicts, who's going to, if there needs to be changes made, who's doing those changes, who's signing off on these reports, whether it's monthly, quarterly, whatever it may be, whatever is determined by your company or your auditors that you need to do. Have some repeatable process so you don't spend time and time every quarter on working on something like this, where you can build a repeatable process. Maybe even something automated that can really reduce the time that you have to look at these things, but they're important areas to look at for sure. So the next area we're going to talk about is audit trails. like I just said, with one of the mitigating controls can actually be having your changelog on and having someone review that changelog report. So audit trails is basically who's making data changes in my system, what are the values, what are the old and new values, when are they making those changes. At a high level, that's what audit trails is, and luckily NAV does have a native control to do this, and they call it the changelog. Most customers that I see are familiar with the changelog. I'd say probably half of them use it. But basically what you would do is you have to go and actually turn on this changelog, activate this changelog. You do it per company, so if you have multiple companies, you'll have to go turn it on for every company and set it up for every company. So it could get a little bit tedious, but that's what you have to do per company. And after you activate the changelog, you actually specify what table data feed or what table data objects and what fields within that table do you want to track. So if I want to track customer master changes, I'll turn on changelog for the customer table, and you can either do I want to track all fields within the table, or you can actually say I only want to do certain fields, and if you choose that, then you go and actually select the fields that you want to track data changes for. So you can get to a point where the biggest thing with changelog is there's possibly going to be some performance consideration you have to take into account, because anytime a data change is made in your system, it's going to have to validate, do I need to track this change? And it's going to have to go out and check this is the field that's changing on this table, and if it's on, then it's going to write a record. So it's going to have to validate that for every transaction. So the biggest thing here is actually coming up with your critical areas inside of your NAV system that you need to know if data is changing. So master data changes, security changes, user changes. Those are kind of the top three that we see. But actually developing that, because you don't want to turn it on for every table and every field in your system, otherwise it's going to bog down. And your two sides of it, you're going to have performance impact if you turn it on for everything. The other side of it is you're going to start generating so much changelog data, you're not even going to be able to sift through all that data and have some report that's going to give you some value. So the biggest item here is really paring down on what is important to track, and then once we set that changelog up, the other part of it is actually reporting on this data. So yeah, it's great that you have it set up and you're tracking data changes, but it all goes back to reporting and actually having someone running a vendor change report and looking at all the vendor changes and actually signing off on that report and saying these are all valid changes. If they find something that's out of the ordinary, that's where they can actually have some evidence that they reviewed it and there was something wrong, and we removed security access from this user. So it's another kind of all that comes back to is actually around this reporting is having some process to say how often am I doing it, who's doing it, and if I have evidence I'm signing off on these. One of the things with the changelog, it's only going to track changes inside of Dynamics NAV. So if you have some user that actually has a SQL account that can actually log into SQL Management Studio behind the scenes and go and start changing data, that's not going to actually show up in your changelog. So that's going to be one critical area that you'll need to look at. Also tracking is that backdoor access to who has access to actual SQL and is going to be able to go in and change those data values inside your NAV tables. One 2013 change I'll note here is at the database level for 2013 with the service tier, it's actually the connections that are made to the SQL database that is actually changing the data is going to be this NAV service account. So if you're tracking if you have your own solution and you're tracking at the SQL level, you're now going to see all of your changes coming across as one user. So that's one change that they did make going to 2013 that you need to be aware of if you're doing some sort of homegrown solution to audit tracking for your data changes inside of NAV. So here's just a screenshot of 2013. So the one on here on the left is the changelog setup where you actually go and click that little checkbox that's saying changelog activated. And then you actually have to go in and tell it what tables and fields you're going to track. So that's a screenshot on the right where you can actually see I turned on changelog for the customer table there. I'm the one that's highlighted. I'm tracking all fields. If you look a little farther down, I have the vendor table data object, and I have some fields checked, which means if I went down there, there'd be a little button I could click and it'd bring up another window, and I could select certain fields that I'm going to track on that vendor table. So that's how you kind of set that up. This next one is actually a screenshot of the changelog entries. So like I said, actually once you have this turned on and you're actually tracking these critical areas, who's reviewing those changes? Changelog entries is where you're going to do that. So you can see here's a screenshot of I was tracking the customer table, and I changed the address of this customer. So that's a master data change. So you can see here that's what kind of that changelog entry looks like for once you actually do get a change to occur. One thing I'll note here is it's per company. So if you have multiple companies, you're going to have to log into each company, go run this changelog entry window. And if you need to do a filter on customer to get all the customers, that's what you're going to have to do. So it gets a little tedious if you have multiple companies, but that's what it's going to be. That's what it looks like. The last item I'm going to touch on, the sixth area of a native control, is the workflow. The workflow that NAV does provide out of the box as a native control is document approvals. So these relate back to your sales order and your purchase orders. So you can actually set up a predefined hierarchy of approval. So you're going to have an approval manager or someone that's doing the approvals, and you can set specific approval amount limits. So you can say this person can approve up to 100,000. This person can approve up to 500,000. So you can see there's going to be some process. This could also, when we go back to segregation of duties, this could also be a mitigating control. So I have access to create a purchase order, and it conflicts with security access. I also have access to change vendor master data. So that's going to be a conflict, but the way I'm going to mitigate that is actually using these document approvals inside of NAV, and anytime I create a purchase order, it has to go to some manager if it's over a certain limit to get approved. So it's a good way to have a process control that can actually mitigate one of your segregation of duties conflicts. So you set up the hierarchy of who's actually going to approve them, what their approval amount limits are. You'll also be able to have substitute approvers. So let's say John is responsible for approving sales order up to 100,000. Say John's on vacation, you can assign a substitute approver. So if he's gone for a week, we don't have to wait a week to get something approved inside the system. So you can have substitute approvers, and then NAV also allows you to do notifications. So if you submit a purchase order and it needs to be reviewed by John, you can send an email. It can have the system email John, say, hey, you need to approve this purchase order that was requested for 250,000 or whatever it may be. And then there's also notification of overdue approvals. If you need to review something within a week, or let's say 3 days, and you don't approve it within 3 days, you'll get another email saying, hey, you have an overdue approval. Take a look at this purchase order. So that's just generally how you can use workflow. It's on the sales and purchase order documents. Here's just a little screenshot of the window that you can do to set up these users. So you actually go into the user setup window, and you can see there kind of how you set it up, the different columns. So I can have a sales amount approval. So that's kind of how it's set up and how you define that hierarchy of who can approve what and what amounts they can approve. And then also you can see a substitute approver there on the right side. So that's just generally another native control that you can use. It's a great one to use as a mitigating control to any of your segregation of duties and conflicts that you may have once you do your SOD analysis. So that kind of wraps things up. We got about 5 minutes left if we have any questions out there. Just as a review, we hit the 6 areas of native controls to help you be compliant inside of your system for security audit. You have your security model actually, securing who has access to what. Your security reporting, actually having some process to report on those security reports and showing the auditors who has access to what in your system. Administrative access, trying to shy away from those super roles and getting more to a managed model where you actually have security assigned, so you don't have everything wide open in your database and it's just susceptible to changes that shouldn't be made. Segregation of duties, actually taking a look at your security that you've assigned. So now that you did the security model, that's step one, that's great, but then going and actually doing an analysis to say, do I have conflicts based on this security that I've assigned? And actually building a process around that to be able to automate it or at least repeat it every so often where you're not spending tons and tons of time to repeat it every quarter or whatever your requirement may be. The audit trail is using the change log to track audit changes or data changes to your system, and then workflow, a great way to use a mitigating control to kind of put an extra process around to make sure everything in your system around purchase and sales order is good to go. So those are the 6 areas. I don't know, Abby, if you've gotten any questions typed in, or if, as I said, the other item I did mention in the presentation was that Osaka SOD rule set, if you're interested in that, or if you have any other questions about security, audit, and compliance in NAV, feel to reach out to me. My email's there, my Twitter's there if you're interested in do that type of thing. So that's all there.
I don't have any questions yet. If anybody has a question, of course, feel free to type that into the question box. And just a reminder to everyone that we do record our webinars, and so a link to the recording will be available on our website, which is abc-computers.com. There we go. It looks like we don't have any questions, Nate. Looks like you covered everything real clear for us, so we don't have any questions.
Sounds good. Well, I hope to see at least some of those attendees at NAVEG Summit. We'll be there all week, so looking forward to it.
Great. Thank you so much, Nate, and thank you everyone for attending today. And check us out for our next webinar. Thanks so much.